My name is Briaunna Embrey-Banks, and this is my ADA report. So, before we break down the ADA, I think it's important that we set a precedent and a foundation of this historic background. So, we're actually going to take it all the way back to 370 BC with the Greece Parthenon temple. This temple had huge buildings surrounding it, and in 9 of those buildings were permanent stone ramps. So at this time, Greece was actually known for accommodating people in wheelchairs. But when we jump to medieval times, there began to be almost a war between the churches and this idea of disabilities, because the churches began saying that disabilities are a punishment for sin. And this ended up becoming the foundation for how disabilities were seen for the next hundreds of years around the world, and including as we see play out here in the United States. That brings us to the 1800s with the Industrial Revolution. During this time, everyone's worth during the Industrial Revolution was looked upon by their monetary contribution. By their monetary contribution to society. So, how much money can you produce a society? So, because of this, disabilities at the time were seen as a burden. Physical and mental disabilities. They were seen as things that needed accommodated, and people didn't want to pay for those accommodations. And this ended up leading to people with disabilities being sent to almshouses for these quote unquote said accommodations. So, some of you guys may be wondering, what are almshouses? Almshouses were church-run buildings with a farm, and anybody who was sent there had to work on the farm, and in return, they would get food, clothing, housing, and medical treatment that they might need. Almshouses were originally created for prisoners released from jail as a form of rehabilitation. However, the people actually sent to almshouses outside of prisoners were poor people in violation of begging, elderly people who couldn't care for themselves, and of course, people with disabilities. Alms began to be considered as big facilities for outcasts in society. And as we know today, these conditions were not ideal. It is said that they had one doctor and or nurse for every 100 patients, and it led to a serious issue of neglect. It is known that almshouses were unclean, overcrowded, and this became a norm seen across America. About a quarter of the people who entered almshouses were known to die, and this was just kind of standard. Eventually, however, sanitariums and hospitals began to replace almshouses. This idea was to give better care for people with disabilities so they wouldn't be mixed in with the prisoners. It became more about, however, controlling the patients rather than helping. We've seen this with the St. Louis City Planetarium. Glad I can talk today. Stories had become public of overdosing patients with sedatives. Oh my gosh. Sedatives and they ended up going public. This was seen as cruel and inhumane. This ended up being one of many stories that come out. In 1867, we began seeing something called the ugly laws beginning to pop up in the US. These are important because they wanted to stop poor people from begging in public. They said it made the US look bad. In reality, these laws began to criminalize people with disabilities. I know you're wondering, how in the world did we get there? Well, let me explain. So, in the writing of these ugly laws, it actually says, and I quote, to describe the people who would violate these: any person who is diseased, maimed, mutilated, or in any way deformed, so as to be an unsightly or disgustingly object for appearing in the public. So, because of their quote-unquote definition, many people with disabilities ended up being in violation of these ugly laws. And the people who did end up being in violation of these laws were sent to these sanitariums. It is also important to understand that during this time in U.S. history, eugenics were huge. Eugenics, for those who don't know, is this idea of breeding out an undesirable trait. Those who follow American history, we've seen this with birth control, especially with Puerto Ricans. It was used as a way to kind of sterilize Puerto Ricans for reproducing. So that's an example of how eugenics works. So as we see it play out here with this idea at the ADA, we saw forced sterilization as a popular way to carry out this idea of eugenics. In 1907, an Indiana law was passed calling for people with disabilities to be sterilized. Similar laws were passed to sterilize the feeble-minded, as they said, because they were unable to appreciate moral ideas, to not being able to read, write, or walk. So that meant anybody who couldn't appreciate, say that again, moral ideas, all the way to people who didn't understand how to read, write, or walk, were found in violation of these laws and were sent to be sterilized. However, a lot of the people being sterilized did not know that they were being sterilized. Many were led to believe they were actually getting surgery on their appendix. Now, this really sets the foundation that we see for almost the modern fight for rights for people with disabilities. The reason I say that is it's actually going to lead us to our next part, is with Dr. Albert Priddy. Albert Priddy was the head doctor of the Virginia State Colony for the epileptics, I'm glad I can talk today, and feeble-minded. This place was like a prison and a hospital ended up having a baby, is the best way I can describe it. He said that he was believed it was his duty to deal with the social problem of people with disabilities that they were causing. His solution was to remove people with disabilities from society, and then they would perform surgical sterilization so that they would not reproduce. Again, this idea of eugenics, kind of breeding out the unwanted traits. So in this case with Dr. Albert Priddy, it was this idea of disabilities. So during this time in Virginia, where Dr. Albert Priddy was located, it was actually illegal in Virginia to sterilize people. However, that did not stop Dr. Albert Priddy from carrying out his sterilizations. However, he was eventually caught doing these procedures, and instead of deciding that, I got caught, maybe I should settle down, he ended up deciding that it wasn't actually him, that it was the law that was the problem. And this began his push for legislation to legalize sterilization in Virginia. He pitched it as a way of he pitched it to the American people as a way that taxpayers can save money. Less people on disabilities is a less of a cost to the state. And in 1924, because of this push, sterilization actually did become legal in the state of Virginia. However, Dr. Albert Priddy said it being legal in the state of Virginia is just not enough. He wanted this to take over the entire United States. So he thought the best way to do this was to take a court case through the Supreme Court in order to get national legalization. He then remembered a patient that he used to have named Carrie Buck. Carrie Buck is an important person to understand. Carrie Buck became pregnant at 23 years old after being raped, and she ended up coming to Dr. Albert Priddy for an abortion. She was turned down because Dr. Albert in the hospital said that she could not have been raped. They said that she was too promiscuous and too feeble-minded, again, that term feeble-minded coming again, to know the difference. She was then added to be on Dr. Albert's list to be sterilized after giving birth, due to Carrie's mom also carrying out a birth of wedlock and being considered, quote-unquote, mentally unfit. The hospital predicted that Carrie's baby would also be unfit. So that brings us to our case, Buck versus Bell. He then requested a hearing with the local courts on sterilization's constitutional or not, and if Carrie Buck is a genetic threat to society. So let's take a pause and really understand this case of Buck versus Bell. So as I said before, Dr. Albert Petty really believes in this idea of eugenics and wanting to weed out or breed out people with disabilities. So in doing so, he's taking one of his former patients, Carrie Buck, and trying to use her case to work its way up to the Supreme Court to try to make sterilization legal across the United States. So, as I said before, he did take Carrie's case to court with the question of if sterilization is constitutional or not, and if Carrie Buck is a genetic threat to society. That led to November 18th, 1924, where the hearing began. It's important to note that during this hearing, only 2 witnesses had actually personally met Carrie, and only one had recently seen her. One of the doctors who spent one day with her and her baby said that her entire family was a part of a defective strand. So this is really important to note. Carrie's lawyer was also known eugenicist and a friend of Dr. Albert's. So Carrie's representation also believed in this idea of eugenics and was friends with Dr. Albert. Dr. Albert then testified himself that if Carrie was sterilized, she could go back into general society and actually get a job and work and get married without society's worry of her having another baby. The court made it to the Supreme Court with an 8-1 ruling against Carrie. Therefore, they were ruling that sterilization could be legal in the United States of America. Supreme Court Justice Oliver Holmes actually wrote in their message after the ruling that it would be better for the world if society prevented the unfit from continuing to breed. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. This actually, his quote, had become a slogan for the entire eugenics movement in America. This case became known as Buck versus Bell, and it ended up becoming the standard for sterilizing people who were seen as unfit. Eugenics stopped being an acceptable way of thinking after World War II. So, let's take a pause. For Buck versus Bell, it had now allowed for thousands of people with disabilities to be forcibly sterilized. Legally, is what has happened with Buck versus Bell. Now, as we proceed forward in time, we have World War II, where we started to see a shift in that mindset. We started to see that shift in mindset due to when soldiers would return home from war with these disabilities. It led to a more national conversation around disabilities, a more positive one of how we can support our soldiers. However, we know many good things don't last because unfortunately, although it led to a positive conversation, it did not lead to much action. That brings us to our next monumental event as it pertains to the ADA, which is Willowbrook State School in Staten Island, New York. This institution had opened in 1947 and at its peak had 6,200 people with developmental disabilities that were being housed there, despite the building only to be made to house half of that. So they were having almost double the amount of patients than the building was fit to have. Residents ended up being experimented on while they were at the Willowbrook by Dr. Sol Krugman. Please excuse me if I say his name incorrectly. He ended up using his patients for human experiments in 1955 to find, as he would say, a more effective way to treat hepatitis, often without their consent, making this illegal, because at the time it was illegal to use people for experiments without their consent. But these experiments continued for 20 years. Many of his patients were locked away and left to die. Sol, however, instead of being remembered for this heinous crime, is still today remembered as one of the most successful scientists in his field. Although it was common knowledge that at Willowbrook, the place that he worked, that the conditions weren't very good, it would take 17 years after Dr. Soul had started these experiments for it truly to come to light what exactly he was doing. So that brings us to 1972, when two young journalists, James Curtin and Gerardo Navarra, they were tipped off by an angry employee at the Willowbrook. So an employee was angry about their employment and had tipped off these two journalists. It is said that the employee had given them a key and that the journalists had snuck in to investigate. While they were in there, they had found what they saw were children that were chilled to the bone. Said that they were chilled to the bone. They said that the place smelled of death. There were absolutely no beds, and hundreds of patients were huddled together during the winter months in order to keep warm, as there were no blankets, and even some children without clothes. Every patient had the exact same treatment, despite each of them having different disabilities. They were also said to be beaten by the guards, and the two journalists had actually called it a badly run kennel for humans. And they would then air their segment on national television. This is important because it ended up being a call to the nation that something needed to be done for people with disabilities. After these two journalists' record-breaking segment, that led to many protests and sit-ins in Congress that ended up leading to the passing of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act. The 1973 Rehabilitation Act addressed issues with people with disabilities, even forcing the government-funded entities to be accessible to everyone. However, 4 years after the act was passed, it was still not into effect. It said that HUE, which is the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, delayed the act. And due to it taking almost 4 years at this point, activists, understandably, were getting sick of waiting. They ended up writing thousands of letters. One activist group, the American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities, the ACCD, ended up telling HUE that if nothing happened by April 4th, 1977, there would be a national protest. Well, April 4th had come and gone with no response. April 5th of 1977, activists had went to HUE offices all over the country to hold mass sit-ins, staying in the buildings for hours and in some locations even days. When they contacted the HUE representatives, they seemed unaware that the act was even not implemented at all. So, due to their frustration, the activists then took their actions to the next level by continuing their protests until they saw real change at the huge HUE office. They were able to do this with help from the local Black Panther groups that they were able to get supplies from at the San Francisco area where they were being held. The mayor in San Francisco even donated mattresses for the protesters so they could sleep more comfortably during the protests. This ended up getting so big that the federal government made several attempts to shut down this protest, including cutting the power and water to the main building they were in, and even sending police. However, the protesters did not budge. Protesters were then able to get the HUE's regional manager to contact his buddies in the federal government and set up a meeting with leaders of Congress. Protest leaders arrived in D.C. on April 28th and convinced Congress to immediately implement the Rehabilitation Act. However, the act only applied to the federal government and programs tied to the federal government. So, great, we finally see the passing and the implementation, as in now it's like an active thing of the Rehabilitation Act. But we have to understand that this only applied to federal government and anything that's had government funding. So, by this, activists had known that the fight was long for over, as they were worried about everyday necessities like accessing restaurants and stores that were privately owned. And during this time, there was a new presidential candidate named Ronald Reagan who wanted to end all welfare programs, including our newly passed Rehabilitation Act. So, after Reagan was elected in 1881, he signed a bill that would cut funding for programs such as those under the Rehabilitation Act. One of these that he decided to address was the National Council on Disabilities. For those who have no idea what that is, it is an advisory agency that advocates for people with disabilities. President Reagan ended up cutting the funding for the National Council and firing all of their members and replaced them with his very own appointees. However, this did not go to Reagan's plan, as the new NCD, which is the National Council on Disabilities, created a report about how the government should enforce disability compliance, because we noticed that although these laws were put in place, they weren't being enforced. Due to this, there ended up being a plea for basic civil rights for Americans with disabilities and called for a change in how the government enforces laws. Because of this plea from Americans, President Reagan saw this report and ended up firing the new head of the ACDC. The report then found its way to Congress, anyway, despite the firing of the new head, and stated that the conversation of how Americans with disabilities should be protected. And in 1988, we began to see the push for the Americans with Disabilities Act, known as today's ADA. This led to our next president, which is President George Bush, who at the time had first served as a VP under Reagan. In order to separate himself from Ronald Reagan, he ended up supporting the ADA, which is much against his former boss. The ADA was caught up in Congress for months whether or not the funding for this was worth it, claiming that it was too much of a financial burden on small businesses. So now we have the talk of the ADA. The ADA is stuck within Congress because they're trying to figure out if it'll be financially worth it or not. Which leads us to in 1889, the New York Times ran an electoral called the Blank Check for Disabled, which again led this talk around American disabilities. And eventually, protest activists, grassroots people ended up getting tired of the mistreatment and tired of waiting for the government, and many disability activists staged a protest in Washington, D.C. on March 12, 1990. This march, they were marching through the streets, ending at the U.S. Capitol building. This ended up being one of the biggest protests for the ADA in the entire world. And 60 protesters at the time when they reached the Capitol building had dropped their wheelchairs and crutches and actually crawled their way up the Capitol building, which ended up being really symbolic to the fight for equal rights for people with disabilities. This became known as the Capitol Crawl. This caught the attention of the entire nation. People were now demanding reparations from Congress were now demanding their representatives from Congress to pass the ADA. Because of this pressure, July 26, 1990, the ADA was finally passed. When the law was first passed, many businesses, however, ignored it and waited to be sued, not wanting to pay to update their buildings. So now it brings us to the actual breakdown of the ADA. So, some of the pros or strengths that we have of the ADA is that in our public spaces, it required them to be more accessible to those with disabilities. So we had saw changes in buildings, like building entrances. You may have seen like the circular entrances as you go through, and then beside it you'll see an automatic door or a regular door. That's because of the ADA. We saw parking lots change, as in for every 25 spots there must be one for people with disabilities. Larger bathroom stalls and shorter sinks were then installed. We saw the implementation of ramps and elevators. It also opened doors for more employment opportunities, as it opened access, like physical access, to more job opportunities. And it also created a way that people can now file and complain for needed accommodations. So those are some of the great strengths that we've seen come out of the ADA. However, of course, there's always room for improvement, and some of the cons we may see with the ADA is this idea of universality, as in the law is not universally applied or enforced. Although it's there, there's no one really holding anybody accountable for following these. Another big thing that we see is insurance disparities. Health insurances, we saw price disparities for them in coverage between people who are disabled and non-disabled people. Also, in unemployment, we have seen an increase for those with disabilities being unemployed since the passing of the ADA. Some other things that we have seen, again, with this idea of universality, is this definition of disability is not exactly clear within the definition of the ADA, making an objective term. So there's just a few of the cons that we have seen. My recommendations as a consultant would be an agency to enforce the ADA, and I don't necessarily think there needs to be a new agency. I actually want to expand upon one that already exists. As you talked about before, the National Council for Disabilities already works with Congress and the electoral branch and the president to lobby for the ADA and for laws. So I think we could expand the powers of the National Council for Disabilities to be able to hold our businesses, schools, and universities accountable for holding the ADA, and also having the council work on a concise definition of disability and advocacy and kind of pushing Congress to do so and to add it as a section of ADA, and to also have this council advocate to have a section within the ADA that specifically addresses the discrepancies we see in healthcare. My advocacy strategy is to have the council hopefully partner with local grassroots activist groups. As we've seen before, advocacy has been a strong push in what we've already seen thus far in the growth of the ADA. Lobbyists. Oh, I needed to delete this. Ignore that. Sorry about that. Lobbyists continuing to lobby for more laws and changes would be another great way to have advocacy. And then also I have here business grants, making an incentive for more businesses to become ADA accessible. As we already see, there are grants for diversity and such. So having one particularly made for businesses that comply with the ADA would be a great incentive to get more businesses to comply. Implementation of this, of the NCD expansion, which is National Council of Disabilities. I would want to have the NCD that already is there work with Congress and the president that they already talked to on ways and how they can expand their powers. Try to continue to advocate for themselves. If this advocacy for themselves does not work, my implementation plan, I imagine this carrying out more in the fans of advocacy and social media and spreading awareness about these ideas to expand the NCD and really putting the hands of the American people to put pressure on Congress and their Congress representatives to expand the powers of the NCD. I would imagine this in a time frame taking quite a number of years. I would give it a 5 to 10 year time span. Although that does sound like a lot, these things do take time and they do not happen overnight, as we often see within Congress. And now, once we get that expansion of the NCD, I would like to be able to hold America accountable. So like I mentioned before, one of those expansions would be having a way for them to actually hold businesses, schools and such accountable for following the ADA. So using the already current filing system that we see to the ADA, I would like to have the NCD actually review these files, and people that violate the ADA, they'd be sent a fine or a final judgment, as similar to the way they already are with the Civil Rights Act that we've seen, in order to make sure that businesses are being compliant with the ADA. And then finally, I would like to actually define this word of disability. As we've seen within ADA, we've seen with many court cases, because of this not being a very broad term and not clearly defined, it has led to many issues. So I'd like to have the NCD, the National Council, as part of the work they already do to advocate with the federal government to actually define disabilities under the ADA Act. So that is my very long presentation. on my ADA report. And I hope you enjoyed.